Odysseus spent 10 years trying to get home, but the gods weren't done with him yet. Ancient sailors knew his story by heart, retelling it across wine-dark seas and enchanted islands, through storms that felt less like weather and more like divine punishment. His name is Odysseus, king of Ithaca, and this is the story of how he tried to find his way home. It is worth taking a breath before we begin, because this story does not rush. It never did. It was told for centuries around fires and in great halls, passed from voice to voice across the ancient world, and somewhere in its long wandering heart is something deeply human, the ache of distance, the dream of return, the strange beauty of a journey that refuses to end quickly. So breathe slowly. Let the warmth of that settle over you. We have time. The war was over. For 10 long years the Greeks had laid siege to the walled city of Troy, fighting on that distant shore, watching the seasons turn and the stars wheel overhead, thinking always of home. The wooden horse, the famous trick that history would never stop talking about, had finally cracked the city open. Troy burned. Its towers fell into smoke and ash. The Greeks gathered their ships, loaded what they had won, and turned their prows toward the sea. Most of them, with the blessing of the gods, would reach home within weeks. But for Odysseus, the man of many turns, the cunning one, the one the gods seemed most interested in watching, the journey home would take another 10 years. 10 more years after a decade of war. 20 years away from Ithaca, from his wife Penelope, from his son Telemachus, who had been only a baby when his father sailed away. We do not know exactly why the gods made it so hard. Perhaps it was because Odysseus had offended Poseidon, the lord of the sea, in ways we will come to understand as the story unfolds. Perhaps it was simply that some men are not meant to go home easily, because the road teaches them something the destination cannot. Whatever the reason, Odysseus launched his 12 ships from the smoking ruins of Troy, and the sea opened before him like an unfinished sentence. The first stop was not peaceful. The ships landed at Ismarus, the city of the Cicones, a people allied with Troy. Odysseus and his men attacked the city, took what they could find, and made the mistake of staying too long on the beach, celebrating through the night. By morning, the Cicones had gathered their allies from inland, and they came down in great numbers. Odysseus lost 6 men from every ship before he could pull away. He counted the losses quietly, standing at the stern, watching the shore recede. It was the first lesson of many. Patience and restraint, 2 things that would save his life again and again in the years ahead, needed to be learned and relearned. They pushed on, and almost immediately the sea pushed back. A storm caught the fleet south of Cape Malea, one of those savage Mediterranean gales that seemed to come from nowhere, whipping the water into white chaos. The ships were driven off course, far to the south and west, away from everything familiar. When the storm finally released them, they had no idea where they were. The stars, at least, were still the stars. Odysseus watched them from the deck in the settling quiet of the storm's aftermath, and tried to hold steady the thought of home. 9 days after the storm, the ships came to the land of the Lotus-Eaters. This is a strange and soft place in the story, and it deserves to be held gently. The Lotus-Eaters were not violent. They were not threatening in any obvious way. They offered the sailors food, and that food was the lotus flower, and whoever ate of it simply forgot. They forgot the war. They forgot the journey. They forgot Ithaca. They forgot longing itself. Some of Odysseus' men ate the lotus, and they wept, not from grief, but because they no longer wanted to leave. They sat on the shore in a kind of perfect, painless forgetfulness, and there was something almost beautiful about it, if you did not think too hard about what had been given up. Odysseus thought about it. He dragged his men back to the ships by force, weeping and unwilling, and had them tied under the rowing benches until the island was far behind them, and the lotus had faded from their blood. He understood something important in that moment. The greatest danger on the road home is not always the monster or the storm. Sometimes the greatest danger is the temptation to stop wanting to go home at all. They rode on, and they came to the island of the Cyclopes. The Cyclopes were a race of enormous one-eyed beings who lived without laws, without community, each one keeping to his own cave on the slopes of a green and fertile island. They did not know the sea. They did not build ships. They tended their flocks of sheep and goats, and cared nothing for the world beyond their shores. Odysseus, curious as always, perhaps too curious for his own good, took a small party of men into the hills to explore. They found a vast cave filled with cheese and lambs and great pails of milk, and they made the mistake of waiting inside to meet the owner. The owner was Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, as large as a crag of rock, with one enormous eye set in the center of his forehead. He sealed the cave with a boulder no 20 men could shift, and when he discovered the Greeks huddled in the shadows, he ate 2 of them for supper and went to sleep. The story that followed required all of Odysseus' famous cleverness. He could not simply kill the giant, because only Polyphemus was strong enough to move the boulder from the cave door. So instead, Odysseus gave the Cyclops wine, strong wine, and told him that his name was Nobody. When the giant, drunk and reeling, finally fell into a heavy sleep, Odysseus and his men drove a sharpened stake into the single eye. Polyphemus roared in pain, and the other Cyclopes came running to the cave entrance, calling out to ask what was wrong. The blinded giant cried out that nobody had hurt him, nobody was killing him, and the others, confused by this answer, went back to their own caves and their own sleep. Odysseus led his men out clinging to the undersides of the great sheep as they were released to graze in the morning light. It was a brilliant escape. But at the water's edge, his pride overcame his caution, and Odysseus shouted back his real name. He wanted the giant to know who had outwitted him. He wanted the story to be told correctly. Polyphemus heard his name, remembered a prophecy that a man named Odysseus would one day blind him, and prayed with all his remaining strength to his father, Poseidon, lord of the sea, asking that Odysseus never reach home, or if he must, that he arrive late and alone, after losing all his men, to find nothing but grief waiting for him. Poseidon heard that prayer. The story breathes a little more gently now, for a while. Odysseus found the island of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, a hospitable man who lived on a floating island with his family, and welcomed the Greeks warmly. After a month of rest and feasting and storytelling, Aeolus gave Odysseus a remarkable gift, a leather bag containing all the winds of the world except for the gentle west wind, which he set blowing to carry the ships home. Odysseus carried the bag himself, holding it tight against his chest, not sleeping, for days on end. They were so close. Ithaca was in sight, a low green shape on the horizon. Odysseus, exhausted beyond measure, finally allowed himself to sleep. His men, curious about the bag and suspecting it held gold and silver that Odysseus was keeping for himself, opened it. The winds burst free in a screaming rush. The ships were flung backward across the sea, all the way back to the island of Aeolus, the journey undone in an instant. Aeolus turned them away this time. He had helped them once, and it had come to nothing. These were men that the gods had clearly abandoned, and he would not test the gods by helping them again. There are moments in this story where the sorrow feels very quiet and very deep, and this is one of them. Odysseus sitting at the stern of a ship that has just lost 10 days of sailing, looking at his exhausted, ashamed men, knowing that they are no closer to home than they were before. He did not shout at them. He had spent enough voice on Polyphemus. He simply sat with the weight of it, and eventually he said to row. The island of the Laestrygonians was the next disaster, and it was the worst so far. The Laestrygonians were giants too, cannibals, and they destroyed all of Odysseus' fleet except for his own ship. 11 ships and their crews gone. Sunk or eaten on that single terrible coast. Odysseus cut the cable of his own ship and rowed out of that harbor as fast as human arms could manage, and he did not look back, or if he did, the story does not tell us. One ship now. One crew. The wide dark sea, endless in every direction. They came to Aeaea, the island of Circe, who was a goddess and a sorceress, daughter of the sun, and whose island lay in the flowing currents of the outer world. She was beautiful and dangerous and entirely unlike anything Odysseus had encountered before, which is saying something given what he had already encountered. When a scouting party went to her hall, she turned them into pigs with a tap of her wand and invited them in for dinner. One man escaped and ran back to tell Odysseus, and here the story offers one of its quiet gifts. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, met Odysseus on the path to Circe's house and gave him a small white flower with a black root, called moly, which would protect him from her magic. When Circe's wand could not transform him, she was not angry. She was, it seems, simply ready for something different. She turned his men back into themselves, feasted the crew, and Odysseus stayed on her island for a year. A year. Ithaca waiting. Penelope weaving and unweaving. And yet a year. There is no judgment in the telling of this. The story of Odysseus has never been a story about a man who did everything right. It has always been a story about a man who kept going, even after the wrong things, even after the long pauses, even after the year of rest and forgetting. When he finally told Circe it was time to leave, she helped him. She told him what lay ahead, including something no living man had done before. She told him he would have to sail to the edge of the world and descend to the realm of the dead. The land of the dead is called Erebus in the old stories, and reaching it required sailing beyond the ocean itself, to a shore where the sun does not shine, where gray rivers run into each other in the dark, where the souls of the departed gather like smoke. Odysseus did what he was told. He dug a pit at the appointed place and poured offerings of honey and milk and wine and dark blood into it, and the shades of the dead came drifting toward him from the dark. He spoke with the prophet Tiresias first, a blind seer who even in death retained his gift of prophecy, and Tiresias told him the shape of what lay ahead. Poseidon's anger. The cattle of the sun god, which must not be touched. The suitors who had invaded his house in Ithaca, courting Penelope, eating his food, assuming the king was dead. And the possibility still of home. Still possible, even now. Then the other shades came, and among them was his mother, Anticlea, who had died of grief while he was away. He had not known. He reached out to hold her 3 times, and 3 times she passed through his arms like mist, because the dead do not hold the way the living do. She told him that Penelope was still faithful, still waiting, still weaving. She told him his father Laertes lived in the countryside in mourning. And she told him that the only way to hold the dead is not with arms, but with remembering. Odysseus wept at the edge of the world, which is perhaps the most human thing in a story full of human things. When he returned to the living sea, Circe gave him instructions for the remaining dangers, speaking clearly and without embellishment, as someone does when they actually want you to survive. She told him about the Sirens, the creatures whose singing drew sailors to wreck themselves on the rocks in helpless desire. She told him to have his men fill their ears with beeswax, and to have himself tied to the mast, if he wanted to hear the song without being destroyed by it. The Sirens did not offer violence. They offered knowledge. They claimed to know all things, every story ever told, every answer to every question. Their song was the promise of completeness, and it was beautiful, and Odysseus strained at the ropes that held him, begging his men to let him go to them, and his men, who could not hear the singing, only rowed harder. And then the Sirens fell behind, and the sea was ordinary again, and Odysseus was still bound to the mast of his ship, coming down slowly from something that was not quite joy and not quite grief. Scylla and Charybdis waited in a narrow strait, the 6-headed monster on one cliff, and the whirlpool that could swallow a ship whole on the other. There was no path through that did not cost something. Circe had told him what to do, and he did it, sailing close to Scylla's side, and losing 6 men, 1 to each of her heads, rather than risking the entire ship to the whirlpool. He watched his men lifted screaming from the deck. He had to watch. A captain who turns away from the price of his decisions is not really a captain. He watched and kept the ship steady and passed through. The island of the sun god, Thrinacia, was where the story made its final demand. Odysseus had been warned. Tiresias had warned him. Circe had warned him. Do not touch the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god, who keeps his shining herds on that island. Odysseus warned his men before they landed, and they agreed, they promised, and then they were stranded for a full month by contrary winds, and their food ran out, and they grew desperate in the way that hungry, exhausted men far from home will grow desperate, and while Odysseus slept, they killed some of the cattle and ate them. When the winds finally lifted and the ships put out to sea, the sky darkened. A storm rose from nowhere, the mast snapped, and the ship broke apart. Odysseus clung to the wreckage, lashing the mast and the keel together into a makeshift float, and the sea carried him where it would. It carried him back through the strait, back toward Charybdis, which was churning and roaring, and he grabbed hold of a fig tree growing from the cliff face above the whirlpool and hung there, watching his raft disappear into the darkness below. When the whirlpool released the timbers back to the surface, he dropped down and paddled away with his hands, alone now. Completely alone. 9 days drifting. Then the island of Ogygia and Calypso. Calypso was a goddess who had lived alone on her island for longer than memory, and when the sea brought her Odysseus, half dead on a plank of wood, she nursed him back to health and fell in love with him, as thoroughly and genuinely as anyone in the story loves anyone. She offered him immortality. She offered him eternal life on that green and gentle island. No more war, no more ocean, no more loss. Just the island, and the two of them, and time stretching out forever. He said no. He was kind about it, the story says, careful not to wound her unnecessarily, because he knew the difference between beauty and home, and he knew which one he was made for. Every day he sat on the rocky shore and looked out to sea toward Ithaca and wept quietly, and Calypso watched him from a distance, and the years went by. 7 years in all. When the gods finally took pity on him, it was Athena who pleaded his case on Olympus, and Zeus who sent Hermes down to tell Calypso that the time had come to let him go. Calypso helped him build a raft, gave him provisions, pointed him toward the stars he should follow, and let him sail away. She watched him go until he was a point on the horizon, and then nothing at all. Poseidon, returning from a feast among the Ethiopians, looked down and saw Odysseus on the water and raised one last storm. The raft was torn apart. A sea goddess named Ino came to his aid in the form of a cormorant, giving him a veil that would keep him safe in the water, and he swam for 2 days until he felt the pull of current that meant land was near. He came ashore on the island of the Phaeacians, bleeding and salt-crusted and barely conscious, and he crawled under a pile of leaves and slept. The Phaeacians were the last kindness before home. Their princess Nausicaa found him on the beach, a remarkable young woman of good sense and gentle dignity, and she brought him to her parents, King Alcinous and Queen Arete, who received him with the old traditions of hospitality that the ancient world held sacred. They gave him food and clothing and a bath and rest. They held games in his honor. And then they asked him who he was and where he was going. And sitting in their great hall, with wine on the table and firelight on the walls, and everyone listening, Odysseus told his story. The whole long winding story, all of it, Troy and the Cyclops and the Sirens, and the land of the dead and Calypso's island. He told it steadily, and without embellishment, the way someone tells a story they have had a long time to think about. The Phaeacians loaded a ship with gifts and laid Odysseus on a bed of soft blankets on the deck, and he slept as the oarsmen rowed through the night, a deep and perfect sleep, the story says, like the sleep of death except for the breathing. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on a beach wrapped in morning mist, and the ship was already gone on the horizon, and Athena was standing beside him in the form of a young shepherd, and she said, quietly, that this was Ithaca. He had been away for 20 years. The rest of the story belongs to the homecoming, which has its own long shape, the disguises and the tests, Penelope and her loom, the suitors and the great bow that only Odysseus could string. But we will let that story rest for tonight. We have followed the long way home, the wine-dark miles of it, and we have arrived at the shore. There is something worth sitting with, as the story settles. Odysseus spent 20 years wanting to be somewhere he was not. That wanting cost him everything he brought with him from Troy, the ships and the men and the youth in his own body. It brought him to places both terrible and beautiful, to the edge of the world and the realm of the dead, to islands where gods offered him everything except the one thing he actually wanted. And he kept going. Not perfectly. Not without his own failures and cruelties, and long pauses in the wrong places. But he kept his face turned toward home. The ancient word for homecoming is nostos, and it is the root of a word we still use for that particular ache of longing, nostalgia, the ache for a home you are not sure still exists, or perhaps never existed quite the way you remember it. Odysseus carried that ache across 20 years and 10,000 miles of open sea, and in the end, the sea gave him back. Perhaps that is the real gift in the story. Not the cleverness of the Cyclops trick, not the endurance through Scylla and Charybdis, but the simple insistence that home exists, that it is worth the journey, that the wanting itself is a kind of compass, and if you follow it faithfully enough, even the long way around eventually ends. The stars are still the stars. The sea is very still tonight. And wherever you are laying your head, that place is yours, and you have arrived. Sleep well.